I don't trust that, but I also don't have any alternative. I just need to click. Standardized, machine-readable privacy policies will live on the internet at a friendly home.
Consent is very closely tied to whatever the privacy notice was saying.
MyTerms is like part of the agentic operating system.
This is After the Magic, a limited series podcast in which Gam Diaz and Sergio Maldonado will discuss the impact of agentic AI on various industries. Gam and Sergio have grown up professionally in a world in which Forrester Research, or Gartner, threw its famous Magic Quadrant, determined, as it by divine designation, the most impactful or advanced technology vendors. It occurred to them that the explosion of startups and competing technologies called for a very different approach to telling the signal from the noise. And it had to begin with two basic principles: unsponsored realism and extreme curiosity. At the same time, every analysis was to be mapped to human values and individual agency. And it is with that mission that they are now humbly bidding for a few minutes of your time. Please bear with us as we polish this over time, but we do hope that you find it valuable and, in a way, unique.
Okay, we're joined by Iain Henderson, who is a long-term marketer and CRM professional who's been working on customer-side data management tools for quite some time, having discovered that things would work much better if individuals were in control of such tools. The last time we coincided with Iain was in the context of MyData, the empowerment tech organization based out of Finland. His day job is with JLINC as the architect for personal data solutions. And through that, he's also part of the DataPal team in the UK. He's also a board member of Customer Commons and has been a core member of the team developing the MyTerms standard, or IEEE 7012. With Iain, we'll try to understand what MyTerms as a brand new standard does, what the interplay is with global privacy control and other opt-out signals, and the huge implications it may have on everything we do as we enter a world in which user-level browser settings become more important than website-specific consent banners, which we all hate. We'll touch on the digital omnibus in the EU and how an opt-in customer-side control was still missing. We will go over the corruption of consent as a legal basis, and we will, of course, speculate about the role of AI agents in all of this. Let's go for it. Iain, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Nice to be here.
And Gam, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And to get started, because people will not be so familiar or as familiar as we are with MyTerms and everything you've done before. Iain, could you give us your perspective on the main pillars of these new layers of empowerment, however you want to describe it, please?
Yeah, if we tackle MyTerms as one of the building blocks, and probably the most important one, because the way I start to think about this is there's virtually nothing that we can all do on the internet, right, or the digital realm where we don't cross into someone else's terms. It's so embedded that we don't even think about it. But if you buy a new PC, right, you go through the manufacturer's terms, and you then go to your ISP's terms, right, and you then go through the browser's terms. So everything you do, right, you are taking another step behind someone else's terms, usually without reading them, certainly without understanding them, and certainly they're not on your side, which is why they're designed to not be read and designed to not be understood. But we've become so inured to that thing over 20 years that we just do it, right? And I think that's That's really what MyTerms is trying to address. I think we kind of sleptwalked into that situation. I tend to think whoever was the first lawyer to build privacy policy on the internet probably said, oh, I've never done this before. This needs to be completely belt and braces. It needs to cover every eventuality. So let's make it 30 pages long, and it's going to say all this stuff. And then the second person just copied the first person, and so it went on. So that became the norm. And over time, and I think maybe what surprised most of us in this space is that model that started probably by accident, because there was no obvious alternative, was then picked up by surveillance capitalism and kind of turbocharged, right, the whole model, because they got longer and more complicated and more all-encompassing. And you then get other spin-offs, things like cookie banners. Right? So cookie banners then emerged because cookies emerged, and cookies emerged because they were friendly things to help you remember passwords and where you were on the site. But all of a sudden, this new branch, third-party cookies and all that tracking side, led to a whole different branch of terms, privacy policies, that would be the cookie banner, covered by different regulations, doing slightly different thing. But from the individual perspective, it's just more of the same, right? It's just another thing that I'm not going to read, right? And I'm going to click on it. Probably the best research or the best explanation I've heard of this phenomenon, which you might call the privacy paradox, was from the Consumer Association in the UK. And the question was, if people are so worried about their personal data as they say they are, why do they keep giving it away in vast volumes? And this research essentially dug into that and said it's because people are what they call rationally disengaged, by which they mean they know there's something not right about clicking that button or the checking that box or whatever it is, but they also know they have pretty much no alternative because the next door site is going to be exactly the same. So the best thing you can do mentally is just to switch off and say, I don't like that, I don't trust that, but I also don't have any alternative. I just need to click, because the only alternative would appear to be not getting the service because I just want to read that thing, or I just want to buy those shoes or whatever. So back to MyTerms, that was a big diversion. MyTerms is essentially an antidote for that, or a proposed antidote to that. The best way to think about MyTerms, I think, and it took us about 9 years to get that standard from initially, okay, we're going to build this thing, to finally popped out into the world at the end of January this year. The best way to think about it, if you read the introduction is really all about manners, right, and social contract. Right? It's not technical. It gets technical later on, but at the start of it, it just says, look, behaviour that would not be acceptable in the real world should not be acceptable in the digital world. Why would it be? Right? Why would you do something online that you wouldn't do with your neighbour or your friend or in the baker's shop or whatever? So that's the top level, is really a big wake-up call, a giant reset that says, why do that when it would not be acceptable in the real world? And how we ever gone down that fork, I don't know, but we clearly did. So the top level, MyTerms, is stop doing that stuff. We need better manners and better social constructs on the internet, as we have built up over time in the real world. Close doors, curtains. Yeah, as Doc Seros would say, we've had these privacy policies and your privacy tools for many years, close and curtains and blinds and that kind of thing. So that's the top level way to think about MyTerms: manners, social contract. Don't do that stuff online if you wouldn't do it in the real world. Next level down, so level 2 is more like the ceremony, where you're saying, okay, in order to change that, the individual at the moment has no option other than to do one privacy policy with company 1, company 2, organisation 3, every one of them is separate, and that's just how things emerged. They were never standardized. So level 2 of the protocol just says, right, there will be a series of standardized machine-readable agreements following the same logic as Creative Commons. So Creative Commons was about copyright. These ones are about an alternative to privacy policies is probably the best way to think about it. There's a few subtleties there. But level 2 is a series of standardized machine-readable privacy policies will live on the internet at a friendly home, customercommons.com or MyDataGlobal or wherever. And people can use this ceremony to say, I want that one over there, right? I want number 3, because that's the one that Oprah Winfrey or Martin Lewis says is the right one because you're just buying a washing machine. So the idea is that the individual can take the first step in the dance and say, I just want that one, which initially will be counterintuitive to the organisation because they'll be going, but we've got our own lovely privacy policy over here. But if the individual is dealing with 100 organisations, you have this kind of compounding effect. The first time the individual does it, it's going to feel a bit weird. And over time, you just set your default. So I think it's worth diverting onto the actual agreements themselves. So you have the ceremony that says, I want that one. And the organisation can say, okay, we agree with that one, in which case you go through it's a bit like DocuSign, which is both parties come together. One of them says, yeah, I want that one. The other party can say, great, we like that one, just sign it, and we both get a copy. So that's the middle layer, which is the ceremony. The agreements themselves, and we've got 5 so far with another 8 or so in the wings. But there's 2 types. Right? There's type 1, which are relationship-based agreements. So that assumes an ongoing, I'm coming here for the first time, but I'm going to come back, right? Because it's an ongoing thing. And the other types are contribution, which assume I'm just coming here once to do something and move on. And obviously you can transition from a contribution to become an ongoing relationship if that's appropriate. But the highest impact one will be the default relationship agreement is just called service only. It's got a more complex name, but the one that will become commonplace, I think, is just going to be service only. And that's actually very deeply rooted in GDPR and that kind of logic that says, purpose limitation, data minimization leads you to be able to say, I'm just here to buy a pair of shoes, right? Or I'm just going to get a passport or a whatever. So that's the service, and the service needs a certain type of data, and it requires certain purposes to be switched on. So the default agreement is, I just want the service, which gives the individual what they want, because essentially you just want to buy the shoes or the passport or the whatever. But by default, it's also saying, and I do not want anything else. Right? I do not want all those third-party cookies, for example.
So for many years, I think you and I have been, and GAM, of course, in the same fora where we've been criticizing the use of personal data in a transactional way and sort of commoditizing personal data and using that as currency or as consideration or anything or as part of a contract. And so something I always thought is a privacy notice or a privacy policy, or some people would just say, or for example, in the data protection world, we often say that a notice is sort of the distillation or the public communication, the tip of the iceberg of the privacy policy that informs all of the practices within the company. But still, it is an effort in transparency. So under the GDPR and the other tools, rather than a contractual tool, it is a transparency tool, so that I tell you what I'm doing because you need to be informed. Whereas a contractual relationship has all of the building blocks of it. So by dragging the privacy notice into the realm of the contracts, then we are first tying it to who is agreeing to it, and that brings the extra pieces that you've been working on, like my key and so on. So who is signing this? Who is seeing this? But also then that is entering that territory where you move from information, from being transparency, to contract. And we used to have these shrink wrap contracts in the world of software, then click wrap contracts where everything is given and the consumer has no agency whatsoever. You just take it or leave it, and we've had that forever in utility contracts, in telco contracts, insurance contracts, sometimes imposed by law, sometimes to protect you as a consumer, to protect us, because there's certain clauses that have to be there so we're protected by the state or whatever. But if you drag that into the space of data protection, the fact that you had to check whenever you see a privacy policy or a privacy notice, as if it were a contract, that has always troubled me, because I'm not agreeing to anything. I know that you are trying to show me that you are being transparent because you're obliged to do it through, Article 13, 14, GDPR, whatever. But I'm not agreeing to a contract. So by creating MyTerms now, then we are forcing companies to be much more intentional about the privacy notice, because it cannot just be empty words, since they're going to be bound by them. So we're dragging the transparency effort into the contractual world. How do you see that idea, that mix up?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So two thoughts occur. Firstly, one of the probably, let's say there's a top 3 innovations within MyTerms. The first one is just that manners. Right? The second one is probably to regard the legal basis for the exchange as contract. Because obviously under GDPR, and if you regard GDPR as a kind of de facto global approach, and there's many things I don't like about GDPR, but the identification of one of 6 mandatory reasons for a data exchange was a good thing. So you have consent, legitimate interest, contract, and then some 3 more obscure ones. And I think what's happened over, say, the 9-10 years since GDPR is consent was regarded as the high bar. I know they say they're all the same, but the reality is for B2C use cases, consent is assumed to be the one you need because that puts enough friction into the exchange. Followed by legitimate interest. If the organisation insists on saying, I'm not going to get consent, but I will assert my right to process some data. And contract has typically been off the table in B2C context. The innovation from MyTerms is actually, think about that differently. Imagine if the contract was written from the perspective of the individual. That then says it's very much everything. A contract can be formed as a consent. A consent can't be formed as a contract. So I think that innovation was based on the assumption from regulators, because I first spoke to some folks in Brussels, EU folks, about 2 years ago, and I said, contract will replace consent, and I was more or less chauffeured out the building. Right, this guy's crazy. Right, it's not gonna happen. But I think I've never yet had anyone push back on that and be able to follow that all the way through to the thing not making sense. So take, for example, right, what are the things that must be inside a consent for that to be valid? Right? Let's say it has to be meaningful, it has to be accessible, it has to be blah, 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 whatever. Let's say there's 7 things that make a consent compliant. If you have a contract that includes all of those 7 things and some other stuff, well, you've then ticked all the boxes that you need for your valid consent, and you've gone beyond it, right? Because it's more transparent, it's better on data minimization, it's better on purpose limitation, and it's better on reciprocity. The second part of that contract v consent thing, the post I did the other day, which I think was called the MyTerms Trust Gap, So I think there's a gap between what organisations do in the kind of privacy notice space, backed by regulators, because regulators effectively said there's the regulation, and organisations, great, says the regulation says we need to do this. So therefore we have what we have now. And even the best deployment of GDPR, I would contend, is a horrible customer experience. So you have this, back to top level MyTerms, what would the individual expect to happen? Well, I'd expect it just to be like the real world, right? I don't expect to have to read 50 pages of stuff before I buy a croissant. So you have this gap between what individuals would want and expect to happen and what organisations and regulators believe to be acceptable. And that's the trust gap.
For a long time, I've been criticizing the consent legal basis because many people believe it is sort of the cure to all ills, for example, in digital advertising and so on. And I always thought it is the least empowering of all legal bases, or at least of the three that we normally use in the business world. And I thought the contract is always so much better because you do have agency, and also because in a contract you can totally see what you're agreeing to. Whereas in consent, it's all hiding. So now I understand where you're coming from.
Contract also makes the enforcement much easier, right? Because it's contract law, right? The contract law has been around for thousands of years.
Consent is very closely tied to whatever the privacy notice was saying. So there's all this is hiding, and then you're consenting. So because there's this commingling, then consent is so corrupted, I'll say. Keep agreeing to things we do not understand. Whereas the contractual legal basis, and very often even legitimate interest, is even better because it goes with the natural flow of things. But the contract is great because that means that there's really a good exchange of terms. And then going and pulling from there, I'm sure you've got plenty of ideas about now how we outline the contractual legal basis, MyTerms, and then identity and everything else that you've been working on forever.
Well, yes, I really, really deeply agree with this in principle. And I'm going to be contentious, and I'm going to throw an elephant.
Sounds like there's a but.
Yeah, there's an elephant in the room here. So far, it feels like the Geneva Convention. It's like, let's agree on, you agree to my terms, I'll agree to your terms, and, everybody lives happily ever after. However, this week, Meta was told to pay $375 million.
Yep.
Based on their income, their net income of $60 billion, they're going to say, yeah, all right, and we'll carry on doing what we're doing. Where's the enforcement? Why should these hyperscalers, these giants, control all of this? I feel that it's, as much as we've campaigned for this, as much as the idea of us creating personal agents and context for our own data and agency over that data, as beautiful as it sounds, I feel like that we are still a 90% chance of having our terms dictated to not only by Google and Meta, but now by the foundation model companies.
Yeah. No, I completely understand where you're coming from. So let me offer my take on that. So firstly, I would agree, right? That is a risk. How we, in the MyTerms Alliance team, and it's a very much an LA forming team, and anyone who wants to get involved absolutely can do. But to Gam's question, firstly, we do not expect the Metas of this world or the Googles of the world to be signing MyTerms anytime soon, because it's not for them at this point in time. At this point in time, it's basically for the little guys, right? The cafe, the corner shop, the whatever, that's not doing any of that stuff that we wouldn't want in the first place. So why should anyone like that have to have, right, their own privacy policy? Well, they don't. They just kind of make it up or ignore it. So I think there's something like 500 million organisations in the world, if you look at Dun & Bradstreet or whoever. 499 million of those are not doing all that surveillance stuff. So MyTerms in the early days, that would be the prime target. We're not going to say no. If Meta come along and say, great, we want to do that, we'll say, okay, let's work with you to make that happen. But the actual target audience is much more the small and realistically the medium-sized business that's looking to, it understands it has a trust problem. So maybe you've got the tiny guys who don't even know there's an issue. If that just happens to show up, if MyTerms shows up in their WordPress, because hold that thought about WordPress, because that's one of our big emerging discussions and routes to market and distribution for MyTerms. So 35% or so of the world's websites are on WordPress. If MyTerms just shows up, oh, here's a badge that says MyTerms welcome here. A bit like Visa welcome here, or MasterCard welcome here, or Amex welcome here on a shop. If that just shows up, right, and it costs, right, £1, right, or nothing, from the small organization's perspective, you might as well just say, well, why not? Right? So if you then get that into that kind of distribution channel, that I think that's part of the story.
I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, how does it come to life? Because you go to myterms.info and people are waiting to see some sort of browser extension. And as you're saying, so it has to happen on both ends so that as a consumer, people will be able to have it on the browser or something. And also as a small company, I love the idea that everyone has been copy-pasting privacy notices without any idea of whether copy-pasting. And you would
so it's meaningless.
A WordPress. Meaningless. WordPress will have a plugin, which is for sale in the WordPress sort of marketplace. And then it would add a privacy notice, which is a copy-paste that has nothing in it because it's floating in space. It's not connected with your internal policy, as we were saying. So if you're going to have something that is really about how you're going to respect people and then the legal framework, the law, then you're better off having something that is already pre-cooked. So that, yes, there could be a match. And also people are more familiar because the browsers are expecting one of these flavors.
Now that makes sense. Well, let's then talk about the top level is manners, middle level is ceremony. Third level and final level, I think, is the deployment. How does it show up? And I think on the one hand, the standard is actually technology neutral. Right? It doesn't really care. You could conceptually request MyTerms on paper, right, or a smoke signal. Right? There's nothing in the standard that says you can't do it any way you like because it's just a proposal, right, an acceptance or a negotiation through to a signing. But one would have to assume there's a number of obvious ways in which it will show up. So the one I'm working on most at the moment is called MyKey. And that's essentially about, it starts a bit like social sign-up. Right? So using exactly the same technology as sign up with Google, sign up with Facebook. It's just like, but it's an identifier that I control. So it's my little bit. It's my little bit of the internet because I made it, right? I create the identifier locally, therefore I own it, I control it. It's mine. It's behind no one else's terms. And that's the critical thing. It's because it's behind no one else's terms, I can use that as the place to stand and say, I want that one. So option one is to build an app-based solution, in which case it becomes like, I've got an app on my phone that is able to propose MyTerms. The organization has what amounts to the ears that allow them to listen for these proposals. And that tool, if the MyTerms trust mark essentially says, oh, somebody's proposing right, agreement 1, service only, we accept that, pop up the QR code and allow the individual to say, great, my agent is talking to your agent and we have miraculously gone through the ceremony and look, I've got a copy of the agreement and so has the organization got a copy. So an app working on a fiduciary basis is one. Strategically, you really want to be in the browser itself, right, and in the mobile operating system itself. And that's absolutely where we will try and go. And thankfully, the European Union is making noises about privacy signals, right, and things like GPC are already up and running. And I think MyTerms is a slightly more subtle version of GPC. GPC is like, switch it all off, therefore people ignore it. Whereas MyTerms, I think, is saying, I want to do business with you. I just don't want all that other stuff that goes along with it. But the most requested feature, if you call it a feature of MyTerms as we were working through the standards process, was, can you get rid of cookie banners?
Yes, exactly.
Because they never want to see one ever again, right? They're a complete and utter waste of time.
Yes.
The EU knows that, the organisation knows that, the lawyer knows that, the individual knows that. Can you, with your MyTerms thing, make that go away? Right? And the answer is yes. Because if you get built into the browser and the OS, and you effectively enhance that initial call from human, right, to web server or app server, and just say, yes, I would like you to send me your content, but by the way, my MyTerms preference is service only, which you can, and this becomes a very long URL, right? It's basically saying, I want your page, but my MyTerms preference is service only, which means do not load any third-party cookies because I just want essential only. And when it's formed that way in the browser or in the mobile OS, there's no need to serve the cookie banner because you already know the answer. Right? The answer is essential only. And I think the really interesting thing, and both of you guys will understand why this is going to get really interesting. And I'm absolutely not saying we have all the answers here. I think we've got a good direction. The pinch point is going to be what happens to marketing, right? Because marketing is typically in that optional cookies bucket, right? I mean, I'm a marketer. This is my confession. I've been a marketer for 35 years. But I am very actively saying marketing needs to reinvent itself for a world that needs that more manners-based level, that does not insert itself through meaningless consent or meaningless legitimate interest, which I think becomes a great opportunity for marketers, right, and marketing to say, okay, we kind of got this wrong over the last 15, 20 years. How might we reinvent that profession, right, to listen to our customers, right? I mean, Gamma's been a big fan of intent casting, right, for many years, and it's never managed to show up at any kind of scale. But I think there's one of the other agreements. I talked about the relationships ones. There's three contribution ones. First one is PDC AI, right, where I wish voluntarily to contribute my data to AI training and operations. Huge subject. Second one, PDC Good, personal data contribution to data for good projects. I want to help cure cancer or fix the city's traffic or whatever it is. But the big commercial one, PDC Intent, personal data contribution for intent, which is I'm in the market for a car, a house, a passport, a kidney transplant, or whatever, and I will release my data under that agreement, which is a contract, which you still get the data, but you've just signed. It ends up with a similar effect to service only, right? I get to share my data for the purposes I wish to share it for, and I don't get any more. I think one more bit of a ramble, going back up to the top level, those of us in the team that were working on the standard, and there's probably 20 or so people, tend to think of it at the highest level, it's I would like the good bits of the internet without the bad bits. And if we design it well, and it's by no means certain, but that's kind of where we're headed, the internet can be a fabulous resource. It can enable millions of great things. We want all of that. We just do not want all the baggage that's come alongside it. If and how we get there and how long it takes, I've no idea.
So Iain, we had this debate about whether the digital omnibus was going to get us closer. So in the EU, the reforms to get rid of the cookie banners, that's the dream. Because in the digital omnibus, there's a few changes to drag some of the elements of ePrivacy as the directive that was more about privacy and confidential communications into the GDPR. And the conclusion that we've reached, at least here, over a few interviews, is that we won't be able to get rid of the banners, sadly, as we are today. Because even though in the US, so here you've got, California enforcing the GPC, the Global Privacy Control, and other similar signals. You've got other states doing exactly the same thing. It's spreading fast. And so the EU has incorporated the idea of listening to the signals. But these are opt-out signals.
Yeah.
And in the EU, because you need an opt-in for many of these things, for example, consent is an opt-in from, again, from an American perspective. That means that you justify the banner, and that websites can still get away with throwing the banner even though you are listening for the signal. So if you have MyTerms, as you say, because it's more nuanced and it's more sophisticated, you can now have finally a built-in opt-in, not just a built-in opt-out.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So we finally would provide a way to really get rid of the banners. We will need to make sure that we prevent websites from asking you again, because the problem here is the conflict of the signals. Your browser is saying no, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the law says now in the Digital Omnibus, for example, is what they're saying, which I think is very useful, is that a website will not be allowed to ask you again for 6 months, whatever it is in the latest version. So that once you've said automatically that you are not willing to go, through the intent kind of consent, you want to share it for good, for AI training, whatever, but not for this, then I should hold before I ask you again for 6 months.
Yeah.
So at that point, the only opening and the only gap in your logic and the strategy, I would say, is publishers, because as you're saying, you want to get rid of all the bad stuff and keep the good stuff. The problem is that the one thing that we all want to keep, we all want journalism to survive. It's the one lobby that is very powerful because it has a lot of political leverage, that is always managing to carve out an exception so that they can still use consent or pay, cookie banners that override every other signal. If you saw a Digital Omnibus for publishers, of course there was an exception, just like consent or pay in the UK and elsewhere.
Yeah.
So as long as publishers are prisoners of a system, it seems like there's always going to be that way out for the banners.
I think you're right, and absolutely that's by no means a finished conversation. There's certainly a branch within the team that's very focused on how does one enable publishers without having all the downsides, and that takes you towards a kind of micropayments type model. Again, when you've got true capability on the side of the individual, you have more of these options. I mean, Gamble have heard in the VRM conversation, why should I not have my own shopping cart that goes around the web with me? Why should I not have my own micropayment capability that just drops a few microcents here and there? The only reason until now you would not have that is because you didn't have that place to stand. When you have to that place to stand, you have these new possibilities. But you're right. I mean, that's a giant. I don't claim to have fully addressed that publisher type thinking. One point before back to you, Gam. We are working with a CMP. I won't name them, but we're effectively working with them in detail to essentially say, how does one program a CMP from the outside, right, from the customer side, right, that goes all the way through the whole consent framework and all of that stuff. So if you imagine this browser header just gets longer and longer and longer, it says you can do that, but you can't do that, and then you can maybe do this, but you definitely can't do that. And if it's a Tuesday, you can do that one. So we are working at that level of detail, but I mean, we need all the help we can get within the MyTerms Alliance team from legal teams in particular. Right? That can, I think we're fairly good on the technology. We can always do with help on the technology.
So Gum, the time for you to please take it to the next level. So now we go into the agentic world, right? Because we've been discussing the human world, and everyone is trying to use agents for everything. So we both are running agents. I'm sure Iain is running some agents, doing things. So now MyTerms can also programmatically consent on your behalf, right? Or accept whatever data your agent is going to share on your behalf. How do we deal with this, Gam? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it is my intention to upset the MyTerms apple cart, because I'm not into the apples, but I think the value's in the cart. I want this cart because it feels like all the policy and all the compliance part feels like those little rubber dinghies that chase oil tankers for Greenpeace.
Yeah, that's a good
this
analogy.
thing is moving so fast and so heavy. But I think the value, as Sergio said, the value comes with agentic, because all of a sudden agentic becomes the vehicle for people to exercise their terms. And I think it now very quickly goes beyond don't show me a cookie banner, is actually when I'm negotiating, when I'm going for a product, I need to state my negotiation terms, not openly, I need to have them in my back pocket, but this is the price that I'm prepared to accept. This is the quality. These are the delivery conditions. And I think if the MyTerms can now be embedded into agentic negotiation protocols, there is such a positive need for this, and it's not a don't do this. It is.
I read your post, and that's fantastic. It is a brilliant build on top of what we're doing with MyTerms. Let me digress for a second. It took us 9 years, right, to get the standard from when we started until it popped out the other end. And we always knew that if it worked, even if we got it out the other end, you'd have a human-centric standard in the world, even if there was no adoption, no deployment. We didn't expect it to take 9 years. We expected maybe like 3 or 4. But the weirdest thing is in that work group, we've been talking about people having agents and organizations having agents to talk to the personal agents for about 6 years. And we're regarded as these kind of weird folk talking about personal agents. So all of a sudden, right, this thing that we always thought was going to be big is potentially really, really big, because it's turned up at a point in time where a person having an agent is, of course you're going to have one. You're probably going to have lots of them. And here's a bit of a secret, which is no longer a secret if I say it out loud here. MyTerms for me has always been a Trojan horse for people getting agents. Right? If people get an agent because they don't want to see any more cookie banners, great. They won't see any more cookie banners, but they've also got an agent. That agent then can do many other things, or it can go and talk to other agents that can do many other things. So you got that kind of Trojan horse that says empower the person with an agent, with their identifiers, with the data, and that comes to the empowerment stack, with their terms, and you've now got a fully empowered, independent individual. You've still got the whole adoption challenge, but at least they've got all of that stack on their side. But you're right, Gam, that's MyTerms. That's whether you call that MyTerms Plus or Plus, or we need to think about that. Yeah.
I mean, if you can make sure MyTerms accommodates all of that, then you can just take it to Y Combinator and pretty much any incubator and say, make sure your startups are building for this, because this is what's coming.
Yeah, well, let me just pick up on what you said. If we can do that, right?
Yeah.
We need more people because of the scale and the timing of what we have uncovered, right? So you need a certain amount of people can get the thing up and running, but it's now here with a timing that's brilliant, with a global reach that, frankly, we've got a bunch of folks in the US, a bunch of folks in the UK, and a bunch of folks in the EU. Not many other places. So we now need to really scale the team, scale the thinking, and make sure we move beyond talking shop and become a very operational focused thing. I also think we need to do, which I believe Creative Commons did, which was essentially go out in kind of beta mode for 6 months, 12 months with your first wave of agreements to see how the market reacts. Because this is unusual stuff that lawyers and commercial people are going to take a bit of time to think about. I would contend when you think about it, they'll come out the other end and say, actually, that's a good thing for us. I started thinking that was a bad thing, but it's really a good thing. But now is the time for both your good selves and others in the same kind of mindset to get involved, because that's the only way it's going to scale to the to where it could get.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have to go back to the thinking table.
Yeah. There's one final point, right, that I forgot earlier on, and I think this is just a neat trick within the standard. There's a bit in there that essentially says the individual should always be the one that proposes terms. It can work the other way around with the welcome mat thing, but let's assume the individual is the one that leads the dance. There's a bit in the standard that says if the individual proposes terms and the organisation responds, great, you go through the ceremony. But if they don't respond, either because they didn't hear your signal in the first place or they chose to ignore it, that's counted. So you have this little counter in the background that's just going, look, one person has asked Facebook once yesterday to respect my terms. Well, who cares? Okay. A million people have done it. Well, absolutely. It's reputational risk because I am offering perfectly acceptable terms. I want to do business with you. Standardized terms, they are equitable, right? They're not designed to be right unfairly on the side of the individual. They're very commonly acceptable and understood. But that counter then just starts to build up and it starts to become embarrassing, I suspect, for organisations when it's going, look, and to Gam's point, when I've now got an agent that's going to ask them every 10 minutes, please respect my terms, hang on a minute, you're going to need a bigger calculator to get all the times that so there's something nice about that. That's how we instantiate that remains to be seen, but that's very much in the thinking.
I think we're moving from the days when we thought everything was going to spin around my data in the sense of a pre-cooked wallet of data. Given I have discussed this a million times, but where data was sort of pre-existing your digital relationship, and then we slowly accepted that everything was so very liquid and that there were some signals and properties that were born with each interaction. And so we moved from that idea of having the little wallet with your properties and preferences that was always static, and then you would expose this to the hospital and this to a world that revolves, and this is what I like about MyTerms, around your contractual relationships. And I think this could be another dimension because my data, again, is very, very liquid. Privacy is a very difficult concept. Again, people confuse it with everything. Whereas contractual relationships generate a back and forth, a consideration, this time frame. And if that's something people can actually maintain, a collection of the contracts they enter into. Yeah. And they could affect many spheres of life. Anyway, just a wild reflection, because I've been thinking a lot about deals. And
particularly if you have an agent to help you. Because I think when you look from the human perspective, right, we've all got, I suspect, somewhere between 30 and 50 organisations that we deal with that matter quite a lot, right? Yeah, your local government, your central government, your kid's school, your employer, your bank, right? Those big ones, and then they're increasingly less important. So you've got a relatively small number of relationships that must work, right? And we all have a confined number. You've then got the next layer out, which is ones that matter only when they matter. It's like my car insurance. Car insurance I don't care about unless I crash the car or I need to renew the insurance. So you have that next tier out. Once you get beyond that, you're starting to get into, hang on a minute, I don't want all that stuff. Just because I bought a coffee and I signed up for a discount in Sorrento 7 years ago, just get rid of it. Right? So you have that. I think when you look from the human household perspective, it actually gets simpler. And particularly when you've got agents to help you out. And I think the other thing that helps me, if I'm sane, stay sane, is I think what happens is the human is moving from client-server world to server-server. So the individual is a node on the network with as much power as any other node on the network. So it just becomes that who can access what, who can read what, who can write what becomes, and I think data exchange becomes more like telephony, right? Or banking that just runs as a network, right? Anyone can phone anyone else if you got the number, right? You can put money into anyone else's bank account if you've got the number, because you've got these rails underneath that says it works as a network. we're not yet there on personal data, and I think that's where it needs to be.
I was thinking, MyTerms is like part of the agentic operating system, and it should kind of live, if A to A is the conversational layer, MyTerms is the layer that sits above it, that actually says, okay, here are the engagement terms.
I think you're right, and then that takes us right back to where we started, which is you can do literally nothing without terms being involved. So they might as well be friendly, machine-readable terms rather than ones that were designed in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Well, any last thoughts?
I think go to myterms.info, get in touch, because we genuinely need to expand the team if we're going to have the reach that we could have, right? And as long as you're effectively on the side of the people should be empowered, I think you guys in particular could certainly contribute when it comes to that. How does commerce reinvent itself for these new capabilities? Right? We basically need people that understand those things and lawyers that understand how to deploy those kind of things in contract law. And yes, there's a load of technology stuff, but that's easier in many ways because you get a limited number of choices. So reach out and we can carry on the conversation, I would suggest.
Well, thank you, Iain. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Good fun.
Thanks, everyone.
After the Magic is produced by Gam Diaz and Sergio Maldonado. AI voiceovers are generated with 11 Labs. This show accepts no sponsors, but you are welcome to reach out to our hosts if you believe you have a mission worth their time. Find them at afterthemagic.com.